Todd McShay, ESPN college football analyst and draft analyst as well, available now on ESPN Plus. Todd McShay's mock drafts, prospect rankings, pro day observations. Also tomorrow, ESPN Plus, Mel Kiper and Todd McShay, a 3-round alternating NFL mock draft. And of course, you have the draft coverage. ABC will be the first 2 days, ESPN on the third day. Todd will be involved with that. Great to see you again, Todd. Is it a good or bad draft because we don't know who the first pick is going to be?
It's a fun draft. I'll say that. I feel more confident today. What are we, 9 days out, right? I feel more confident today than I did 10 days ago on who's going to be the number one pick. I really think it's going to be Bryce Young. You know, all the information we're getting out of Carolina, and they're trying to keep it quiet, but it's hard when you have the first pick, and it really comes down to two guys between Alabama's Bryce Young and C.J. Stroud from Ohio State. The information is going to get out. So I can't say it's 100%, but I feel really strongly that it's Bryce Young at 1. Now, where this class gets really interesting, and if you had asked me 10 days ago or 2 weeks ago, I would have said it. If it's not Young, it's Stroud at 1, and if it's Young at 1, it's Stroud at 2. The closer we get to the draft, the more information I'm getting that Houston is not going to take C.J. Stroud at number 2. If Bryce Young was available, I'm told that they would take Young at 2. So what does that mean, right? So if Houston stays at 2 and takes Will Anderson, and remember, DeMeco Ryans comes in as the head coach. You got Nick Caserio, the general manager from Bill Belichick, with a relationship with Nick Saban. And DeMeco Ryans comes from San Francisco, where they built this great defense and been able to plug in quarterbacks and get to NFC championship games. And he's a defensive guy with Alabama roots. So Will Anderson would make sense at 2 if you're comfortable with your quarterback situation, which I don't understand how Houston can be. But if they're not sold on one of these other quarterbacks, then maybe they go Will Anderson at 2. And now Arizona, they went from having a prize pick at 3 to having, I mean, the stock rises on it just tenfold. Because now, like, I was told that Las Vegas was very interested, and I know for a fact they tried to get up to number 1. They weren't able to get a deal done. Carolina gives up the farm to go up to 1. And I was told that they're not interested in any quarterback not named Young or Stroud. But now they're in the mix. If Houston goes Will Anderson, Arizona now could trade out. And if Houston sits there at 2 and says, you know what, we love Will Anderson, but what can we get for this pick? And if you're Houston, right, and you're going to pass on Stroud, that's one thing. But if you're going to pass on Stroud and now you're handing him over to a division foe and you've got to face him twice a year, Indianapolis sitting at 4, or Tennessee at 11 could leapfrog Indianapolis and get up to 2 or 3. I would want to control that if I were Houston. I would want to make a deal with Las Vegas, move down to 7, still get a great player, but also get additional picks and make sure that Stroud is not in our division. So that the draft kind of starts at number 2 for me.
Yeah, I was going to ask you where the drama started, and you just answered that. But also this time of the year, trying to get real information, Todd.
Yes.
Because I tell my audience, don't believe anything that any of these coaches or GMs or owners say.
Right.
But what should we believe?
Well, it's funny because every team that's not in the quarterback market has a big opinion on the quarterback. Right? You know, I can talk to teams drafting in the 20s and 30 and 31, and they love to give their opinion on Will Levis. We wouldn't take him. Anthony Richardson's too big of a project, you know. But when you're up there and you're sitting at 4 like Indianapolis, you're sitting at 7 like Vegas, or 11 like Tennessee, and you need a quarterback, they tend to look a lot better than the teams that don't need him. So it's tough this time of year. Obviously, I lean on my relationships. I get information typically from other teams that have information or have friends within those other teams that there's kind of some leaks. And then I always bounce things off of Schefter and Mortensen because they're typically hearing the same things or different things and try to balance out that information at this point. But it's difficult. I mean, the amount of disinformation that is fed out there in the public, and you see on Twitter and those sorts of things, I laugh at because I get off the phone with a general manager one day and a director of college scouting the next day, and then I'm reading these things and I'm like, that's the exact opposite of what they're saying, you know?
I have a friend who's a scout who's been a great resource, and I always say to him, give me somebody that we should be keeping an eye on. And he's been pretty good at giving me that guy in the first round. But I said, what do you think about Bijan Robinson at Texas? He said, I would love to see him as a Deebo Samuel type of player where I can use that running back, that talent, but also I can keep him in the system and not overuse him as a running back and maybe have this hybrid here. So I don't know if it feels like we're gun shy with running backs, but his grade on Bijan Robinson is through the roof. He said, I love the kid. He's got great hands. I would love to see him as a Christian McCaffrey type. And McCaffrey could probably play, a slot receiver, but I wonder your thoughts on Robinson and the running back position.
Bijan can play slot receiver. And if you studied his tape at all, and I've got clip after clip of him in the slot, not running like, underneath routes, but getting down the seam, catching in traffic, catching the ball over his head, contested situations. He can do all that. When I talked to Coach Sarkisian before the TCU game this year, he said, listen, we're trying to limit his touches. We're not trying to wear him out. But the catches he makes in practice, like you'd be shocked. Like, I know there's good game tape, but the things we see in practice are out of control. So I could see him in more of a hybrid role. But I'll say this, I've got him as the number 2 ranked player in this class behind Bryce Young. I haven't talked to a team, I'm talking probably close to a dozen teams that have him outside the top 5. Everyone has him in the top 5 in terms of their grades. Now, where does he fall? That's the fascinating part. I mean, Philadelphia doesn't take a running back in the top 10. They love taking offensive and defensive linemen, but that's the first spot where you can look and say, that might make some sense. I think he's just as talented, maybe a little bit more unique than Saquon Barkley, and Saquon was the number 2 overall pick. But you see the beating and the injuries that Saquon had, and you just wonder, is it worth it? So it may get down to like 18 to Detroit, 21 to the Chargers with Austin Eckler having issues there.
Yeah.
And I still hold this out. Dallas is obsessed with getting a running back that can be their guy, be a compliment to Tony Pollard like they had with Zeke when Zeke was, more closer to his prime. Mike McCarthy was dying for a big power back like that, wants to run the football. They want to be a run-based team, and they would love to bring the Texas star into Dallas and make him the star of their offense. So Dallas is sitting at 26. It wouldn't shock me if they made a splash, jumped up into the teens ahead of teams like Detroit and the Chargers and went and got Bijan maybe around like 14, 15, 16.
Talking to Todd McShay, ESPN college football and NFL draft analyst. This feels like an I told you so draft 3 years down the road. That somebody's going to go, I told you about Hendon Hooker. I told you about Anthony Richardson. Good or bad. Hey, I told you about C.J. Stroud. Do you get that feeling, or is that every year that it feels like an I told you so 3 years down the road?
No, I think it's more so than this year than it has been in past years. Last year, we knew that there was maybe one quarterback in the first round. The group wasn't very good. I think with the quarterback specifically, after C.J. Stroud, and even, in NFL teams, some teams are mixed on C.J. Stroud. I've talked to so many teams that are so concerned about Will Levis, and I've talked to a couple teams that love him. Anthony Richardson, we all see it. I mean, he's a phenom. He's different than everyone I've ever evaluated.
But I saw it, Todd, but then I didn't see it. Like, that's my big concern. I was like, damn, look at that guy. And then it'd be like, oh, is Anthony Richardson playing? Oh, he is.
The roller coaster of his draft stock has been similar to the roller coaster of watching his tape. Like, I did the Kentucky game, and so I was fresh off the Utah game earlier this season. After the Utah game, Heisman Trophy, number 1 overall pick. This guy's like better than Cam Newton, in his prime. And then the Kentucky game, I'm on the sideline. And first of all, it was great being on the sideline with the Kentucky defense. I can't use half the words that were said, but every time they got 3 and out, just Heisman this, Heisman that. They had a great plan. They took away the run. They played with discipline, and he looked lost. And that was right after the Utah game with the 45-yard touchdown run and juking the guy at the last minute to get into the end zone. And we saw what he can be physically. But then a week later, we saw how inexperienced he is. So I'd love to see him with Shane Steichen in Indianapolis. Steichen has worked with Justin Herbert and Jalen Hurts and has developed quarterbacks. But do they have the patience to wait a year with Gardner Minshew as their starter? And so so much of it is going to come down to where these guys wind up going. But you're right. There are a lot of I told you so. It's either good or bad in this class.
Give me the team that should draft a quarterback that maybe we're not keeping an eye on?
Minnesota. I think Minnesota should. They're sitting at 23. You've got Kirk Cousins, who's going to turn 35 this summer, was 23rd in QBR a year ago, continues to struggle in big situations. We go back to that fourth and a few yards last year. And in any big game, he has struggled. He's got 1 year left on his contract, and it would be a perfect time to bring in a bridge quarterback. Now, at 23, they don't have a second-round pick. So it's not like they have all this ammunition to go up and move to get one of these top 4 quarterbacks. So it could be Hendon Hooker, where they say, you know what, maybe we've got an early second-round grade in this guy. He had ACL injury, surgery in November. Maybe we have to sit him a year, but this is the perfect situation to sit him for a year. The only issue is he's going to be 26 in January, of his rookie year. So now you're talking about 27 before you're putting him on the field, but it's still a quarterback. And if you draft him in the first round, remember you get that 5th-year option. So it makes more sense to take him in the first. So Minnesota, I know from people in the league and from sources I have, they've been doing a deep dive kind of quietly into this quarterback class. So it wouldn't shock me late in the first if they took one of these guys.
I'm sure you remember this. Merrill Hodge was discussing Johnny Manziel.
Yeah, I saw it on Twitter this week.
With Skip Bayless.
Oh, yeah, classic.
And Haji was never a hot take guy. Like, he was a football nuts and bolts tape guy. Yep. And, Skip, of course, is hot take. And, Haji's like, no, you don't take this guy. Not in the first round, second, third, maybe 5th round. And then Skip said, you couldn't be more wrong about that. I think we're all fascinated with Manziel on how he was so spectacular, but he failed so spectacularly.
Yeah. First of all,
was it smoke and mirrors?
I got to work with Haji and Jaws and those guys. And, we would do all, Kuiper and I and a bunch of people in studio would do all these shows leading up to the draft. And I used to call it the NFL Films Biker Gang. Haji and Jaws, they'd come rolling into Bristol like a week before and tear up all these mock draft ideas. Manziel sucks, and this guy sucks. He can't play, But I loved it. And more often than not, they have really good points. But with Manziel specifically, he was unique to college because he could get away with things in college that he couldn't in the NFL. And I know he had his best game against Alabama, which was essentially an NFL defense. But physically, there were limitations that allowed him to be great in college where he couldn't pull it off in the NFL. And he got away with a lot of slop and a lot of backyard football. And when he had to play within structure, he wasn't there. And I think the most important thing is he had so many things outside influences. There was a lot of partying and fun. He loved what football brought to him. I don't think he truly loved football and was dedicated to do what Peyton Manning and Tom Brady and Drew Brees and all the great quarterbacks over history have done in terms of putting in the day-to-day grind.
Always great to talk to you, and look forward to talking to you again soon. Thank you, Todd.
Yeah, you too, bud. Take care.
Todd McShay, ESPN College Football NFL Draft Analyst.